Okay, you guys, today we're going to be talking about angles, and specifically, if you go ahead and look here, it says parallel angles cut by a transversal, and these are notes A. We're actually going to have two sets of notes this week just because of the amount of material that we have. So the essential question today, what they're asking us to do, they say, how do I identify? So we're going to be looking, so go ahead and draw yourself a little eyeball, because we're going to be looking for something. How do I identify a pair of angles when two parallel lines are cut by a transversal? Okay, so those might be words that you have never heard before or maybe heard in passing. So let's go ahead and answer a couple of questions before we actually get into the types of angles we'll be talking about today. So we know we're going to have to identify or look and maybe name something. So the first question is, what are parallel lines? Okay, so parallel lines are lines that never cross. That never is really important. Lines that never cross. Make sure you are writing these things down in your notes or typing them in, but lines that never cross. Okay? Well, never is a pretty big word because that means it could possibly not ever happen. So when we're talking about parallel lines, we're talking about lines that are maybe going horizontally that will never cross. They'll keep going and going and going. That's why I have the arrows at the end. It shows that they'll keep going and going and going, but they'll never cross. They'll just keep going in both directions. Or they may look diagonal, but they're at the same slope. And so those are just going to keep going and going and going forever. Or they may even be vertical. But either way, they have the same slope. So they'll keep going and going forever and never cross. So the key here is that they have the same slope. And that's really important. In fact, let's go ahead and write that down in our notes. They have the same slope. Since we've already talked about slope, that is an important piece of information. That means they will never cross. Okay, so what is a transversal? Well, transversal is pretty easy. A transversal line is just a line that crosses two other lines. So a line, that means one, a line that crosses two other lines. Okay, what does that look like? Well, in order to do this, let's go ahead and draw two other lines first. So let's draw two lines. We'll draw two parallel lines. Here are two parallel lines. They have the same slope. Okay. And now let's show you what a transversal looks like. A transversal is something, a line that cuts through. So it crosses the two other lines. It doesn't necessarily have to be diagonal. So I'm going to call this T for transversal. It may look something like this, where you have two parallel lines, just like we drew up there, same slope. And my transversal is maybe going to go straight through this way. And we'll call that T. So it's anything, any type of line that crosses through two other lines. Okay, so we're talking here, the essential question said that we have to identify angles given two parallel lines cut by a transversal. So now we know what that looks like. Two parallel lines cut by a transversal. There's two examples for you right there. So let's go to talking about the types of angles, okay? Because eventually we're going to be finding the measures of an angle. Today we're going to identify angles. So let's go ahead and write identify. That is important because we're actually not finding the measure today. Identify. So we're going to identify angles. Okay, and there's basically four types of angles we're going to be talking about. The first one is corresponding angle. So go ahead and underline that or highlight it if you have a highlighter. And corresponding angles is when they have their corresponding or their matching corners. So for instance, if you see here, for this one, these two blue, they correspond to one another. In fact, let me do that in blue just so that you can see a little bit more clearly. This angle here and this angle here are what we call corresponding angles. They're in the same corner, just a different place. If you see another set of corresponding angles, here's one in this corner and here's one in this corner. So they're in the same corresponding place. A lot of times what I tell my students is we look for an F. See that F there? And then we find the two angles in the same corners, one on top, one on bottom. Okay? The cool thing about this is both angles are equal in measure, so we can go ahead and write that down. They are equal in measure, which is called congruent. So when you're talking about angles, you're talking about congruent angles. That means they're equal in measure. For example, I'm gonna name those A and B. If angle A is say 28 degrees, then how big is angle B? Well, that's easy. They are congruent or equal. Therefore, angle B would be 28 degrees. So they're completely equal. Okay, let's go to another one. Let's talk about alternate interior angles. Okay, interior always means inside, right? Inside. And alternate means opposite. So that's important to know. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at these. It says they are inside parallel lines and opposite sides of the transversal. So they have to be inside the parallel lines. Okay, here's the parallel lines, right? You see those. And they have to be opposite one another. Okay? And so let's go ahead and I'm going to show you for my students. So this one was an F on top. This one would be a Z. You see that Z there? If you can make a Z and you find the ones that are in the corners, that's alternate interior. Or the red ones too. You can make another Z. Okay, alternate interior. So they're on the opposite side of the transversal. The transversal, don't forget, is the one that always cuts. So here's a transversal here, here's a transversal here, here's a transversal here. Okay, so they're the opposite sides of the transversal, but inside the parallel lines. So inside the parallel lines and opposite of the transversal. Okay, the cool thing about this one that I love too is that both of these angles are equal in measure, which means they're called congruent. Well, this is wonderful because if we have to measure it, if I have one, then I know the other. Okay, then we have this other kind called alternate exterior angles. Okay, exterior always means outside, alternate always means opposite, right? So in this case, these angles are outside the parallel lines. Okay, oops, let me do that with a pencil instead. They're outside the parallel lines and they're opposite sides of the transversal. In this case, they are outside the parallel and they are completely opposite. Okay, so this one's a little bit trickier again because they're alternate. We can do the Z, right? But in this case, they are on the outside. If you see here and here, they're on the outside of the Z, but on the they're alternate. They're outside and then on the other side of the transversal, outside of the parallel and on the other side of the transversal. Okay, and the cool thing about this is that both of these angles are equal, which means they're congruent. They're the same. Okay, so if one's 12 degrees, the other one's 12 degrees. There's only one that are not congruent. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to our last piece, which is consecutive interior. Okay, consecutive interior. And consecutive interior angles are those angles that are inside the parallel lines and on one side, or the same side. Okay, so inside the parallel lines, and they're on the same side as the transversal. And this one's pretty easy because we have an F, we have a Z, and then we have a C. We'll use this one as a C right here. Okay, and you see that our two angles inside, whether red or blue, I don't really care. Okay, we can make a backward C, it doesn't matter. But what's cool about these are the only ones that both of the angles together, both of these angles are supplementary, which means their sum is 180. And you guys just got done working with supplementary angles. So in this case, supplementary, together, these add up. If you were to add them up, they would add up to 180 degrees. Okay. Today we're not talking so much about the measurement. We're going to be doing that on Wednesday. But what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be identifying. So with identification, I just went ahead and popped this practice up here. What it's going to do is it's going to give you an example, just like what you see here. Here's the example, and they want you to tell us what kind of angle it is. Is it alternate exterior, alternate interior? You have your four choices. And so once you do that, you're going to tell us what the answer is and why you say it is alternate interior, exterior, whatever it might be. We do have the answer key at the bottom, and notice some of the answers duplicate themselves. So there's more than one that is maybe a corresponding angle, so on and so forth. So you're going to be working on that practice tomorrow, but today we just want you to review your notes and make sure you understand the difference between the four angles.